By the time Monica Seles finally walked away from professional tennis for good, most of the world had already decided her story was over. The stabbing, the 2 lost years, the improbable return, that 9th Grand Slam in Melbourne, it was the kind of arc that felt complete. A tragedy with just enough redemption sewn onto the end to let everyone breathe out. But the truth is that the most important part of Monica Seles' life never happened under stadium lights at all. It happened quietly over the 2 decades that followed, in the years almost nobody was watching. And in some ways, it was the bravest tennis she ever played. That afternoon in Hamburg quietly rewrote the entire sport. And to understand what Monica Seles did with the rest of her life, you first have to understand what her attack did to everyone else's. The shockwave started almost immediately, and the first thing it changed was the way tennis thinks about safety. Before April 1993, a professional tennis court was a strangely open place. Players sat during changeovers with their backs to the crowd, separated from thousands of strangers by nothing more than a low advertising barrier, in a genteel sport that simply never imagined someone would climb out of the stands to do harm. Günter Parche exposed that assumption as a fantasy in the space of a single second, and in the years that followed, that fantasy disappeared for good. Security became the new normal: more guards, protected zones around the players, barriers rethought, access restricted, changeovers watched. Every athlete who has walked onto a court since has done so inside a bubble of protection that exists in large part because of what happened to a 19-year-old girl in Germany. It's a legacy that every player quietly benefits from. Tennis moved fast to guard its players from the stands. What it did to Monica's standing in the game was another matter entirely. Less than a week after the attack, while Seles was still recovering, still traumatized, still unable to imagine holding a racket again, the Women's Tennis Association gathered many of the game's top players and asked them to vote on a single question: should Monica's #1 ranking be frozen while she recovered? The answer was almost unanimous. No. Of everyone in that room, only Gabriela Sabatini declined to vote against her, choosing to abstain. The rest agreed that the most dominant player in the world, stabbed on court through no fault of her own, should simply be allowed to slide down the rankings as if she'd chosen to walk away. The consequence was immediate and brutal. With Seles frozen out, Steffi Graf could reclaim the #1 ranking within weeks by winning the French Open, which is exactly what she did. The very outcome Parche had committed a violent crime to produce was now being handed to him, not by a knife, but by a vote. Years later, Martina Navratilova, then head of the Players Association, would say plainly what many were thinking: that the players who benefited most from Monica's absence, who won the titles and the prize money she wasn't there to take, were the ones least willing to protect her. The sport she had dominated left her behind. When she finally returned in 1995, the WTA tried to make it right. With Graf's agreement, they installed Seles as co-#1 for her first handful of tournaments, a gesture designed to let her rebuild without the impossible pressure of starting from nothing. But you cannot vote someone's confidence back. And the bitterness of that original decision has never fully faded. Even today, decades later, whenever a player asks the tour for special treatment, someone somewhere brings up the fact that the WTA wouldn't even do it for Monica Seles. And the attack cost tennis one more thing: the rivalry that never was. For a brief window, Seles and Graf had been building toward one of the great rivalries in the history of the sport: the ferocious, grunting teenage prodigy against the elegant, relentless German champion, 2 utterly different games colliding at the very top. It should have defined a decade. Instead, one man decided he couldn't accept it and froze it in place forever. Graf went on to dominate the rest of the 1990s, retiring with 22 Grand Slam singles titles and a permanent place in the argument for greatest of all time. And to this day, the sport is left with an unanswerable question: how many of those matches, those slams, that history, would have looked completely different if the rivalry had been allowed to run its course? We will never know. Seles, for her part, never played a professional match in Germany again. She didn't have to explain why. So that's what the attack did to tennis. It hardened the sport's security, exposed an ugly failure of loyalty, and stole a rivalry that could have been legendary. But while the game moved on and reshaped itself around the event, the person at the center of it had a much harder job. She had to rebuild a self. After that 1996 Australian Open title, the tennis was never quite the same again. The reflexes were still there in flashes, the will was still ferocious, but the aura of total invincibility, the sense that she simply could not be beaten, had been left behind on a court in Hamburg. She kept playing anyway. She became an American citizen in 1994, and in the year 2000 she stepped onto the court in Sydney and won an Olympic bronze medal for her adopted country, one last piece of hardware from a body that was slowly being asked to do more than it could give. She fought through injuries, ranking slides, early round exits that would once have been unthinkable. Her final competitive match came in 2003, though she wouldn't officially announce her retirement until 2008. The greatest what-if in tennis history quietly closed the door. In the middle of all of it, in 1998, the person who had built her father Carroy, the cartoonist who first put a racket in her hands and drew pictures on tennis balls to make a 5-year-old smile, lost his battle with cancer. The man who had designed her strange two-handed genius from nothing was gone. And Monica was left to figure out who she was without the two things that had defined her entire existence: her father and the certainty that she was the best in the world. It was then that a private battle started to take hold. Because for years, long before the public knew a single word of it, Monica Seles had been fighting an eating disorder in almost complete secrecy. Tabloids speculated cruelly about her weight, treating it as a punchline, as evidence that the champion had let herself go. On the inside, she was drowning in something she didn't have a name for yet, tangled up with the trauma of the attack and the grief of losing her father. But then she did something unexpected. She stopped hiding. In her 2009 memoir, Getting a Grip, she wrote openly about the depression, the binge eating, the shame she'd buried for a decade, and in doing so became one of the first global sports stars to talk about mental health and disordered eating as real, survivable struggles rather than weaknesses. She turned her worst secret into a message. She became a public advocate for eating disorder awareness, reaching people who thought, as she once had, that they were simply broken and alone. She reinvented herself again and again with the same stubbornness that once made her impossible to beat. In 2008, she went on Dancing with the Stars, having never danced a step in her life. She wrote young adult novels, a whole series set at a fictional tennis academy. She became a motivational speaker, standing in front of rooms full of strangers and telling them the parts of her life she'd once been too ashamed to admit even to the people closest to her. The girl who had hidden her struggle in hotel rooms became the woman standing on a stage saying, "This happened to me too, and you can come back from it." In 2009, the sport elected her to the International Tennis Hall of Fame, a permanent acknowledgement that even a career cut in half belonged among the greatest ever. And away from the cameras, after everything, she finally found peace, building a life with businessman Tom Golisano and announcing their engagement in 2014. But life, as this story keeps proving, was never quite finished testing her. In August 2025, Monica went public with one more battle, a diagnosis of myasthenia gravis, a rare autoimmune disease that causes muscle weakness and double vision. She could have kept it quiet. Instead, once more, she chose to speak, lending her name to an awareness campaign so that others facing the same frightening diagnosis might feel a little less alone. And maybe that's the real answer to the question we started with, not what happened to Monica Seles, but who she chose to become afterward. Because the trophies, the records, the terrifying teenage dominance, those were never the most remarkable thing about her. The most remarkable thing was what she did every single time life ripped the ground out from under her. The stabbing, the eating disorder, her father's death, and now this. 4 resets. and 4 times she found a way to stand back up and keep swinging. Monica Seles never got to find out how great she might have been on the tennis court, but she showed us exactly how strong she was in life. And that's where I'll leave it for today. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If Monica's story stayed with you, do consider giving this video a like and hitting subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.